I am Father Michael J. Kelly, and the one who was at the university and so often enough still called Professor Kelly, even though it's many years since I left the University of Zambia.
Yes.
This year, to my great delight, I will be 70 years a Jesuit. I joined the Jesuits in September 1946. After my first years with the Jesuits in Ireland, I came here to Zambia as a young Jesuit and taught at Canisius College for a couple of years, mostly mathematics and science. Canisius was beginning sixth form at that time, and they needed a maths teacher. And I said to my superior, I just have to go back, they really need me. And remember that the Jesuit charism is go where there is need. When I got back to Canisius after a short time, I was appointed as the principal, as it was called at that time, of the school, or the headmaster as we would call it now. And I was in charge of Canisius School during wonderful years, the years of independence, the beginning of independence. I was the head of the school at that time, and the years that followed, for 6 or 7 years, I was in charge of the school and the development of the school. And it was a great pleasure to see it developing, to see the new Zambian government willing to pour in resources to help us to develop, and to have with me a group of colleagues, Jesuit and lay, Zambian and non-Zambian. We all worked together. It was really wonderful. There was a tremendous spirit in this college. It was called Canisius College, not Canisius School at that time. There was a wonderful spirit there, and it invigorated every one of us. The enrollment increased greatly. Because of the opening of the University of Zambia, we stopped the sixth form. But before we stopped it, we had the unique distinction among Jesuit higher schools that we had girls in the sixth form as well as boys. The girls were boarding, but they stayed at the convent which was nearby. And so we had that remarkable thing that we had quite a number of girls as well as boys, and this was always a great challenge, but it was also a great honour and privilege to have these with us. And I went for higher studies, PhD studies in education administration, and I did those in England, spent a number of years there, and then came back to Zambia, and with my qualifications I joined the University of Zambia. Very quickly I was moved there up into a higher position, into being Dean of the School of Education. That was in 1975. I stayed in that position for a couple of years, and then in the Senate of the University of Zambia elected me to become the Pro-Vice Chancellor, as it was called then, but then during my period as Pro-Vice Chancellor, the title was changed to Deputy Vice Chancellor, and I remained in that for a number of years. Significant developments at UNZA during those years. Probably the most outstanding one was the establishment of the School of Veterinary Medicine, and I was personally involved in that all the time, working in that, working to get the Japanese assistance that made that necessary, working with the FAO, who were also involved in it. So they were great years also, wonderful years. Really, looking back, all the years were wonderful years. One year was better than another year, than the one that went before it. It was all so wonderful and so challenging and fruitful, and all the time the Jesuit motto was there very strongly. The motto, AMDG, ad maiorem Dei gloriam, to the greater glory of God. And a Jesuit poet has put that in another way. Gerard Manley Hopkins, he put it, I have this one work to do, let God's glory through. And in all that I was doing at UNZA in those years, I was trying to do that. When I left off being Deputy Vice-Chancellor at my own request, because I felt the pressures were coming on me, and I felt also it was time to stand by and let a locally born Zambian take over this post. While I was Zambian, I wasn't locally born, unfortunately. And so I went back into teaching and research, and I stayed in that for a long number of years. And one of the things that sticks in my mind from those years was the enthusiasm and the support of the students. They were really a wonderful body. We had a huge number, 200 or 300 of them in a classroom, and I had to lecture them a couple of times a week and then organise that they were in different groups for tutorials and that. But they were wonderful the way they came, and I experienced this in two different ways. I didn't know every student, obviously, in such a big number and changing every year. But many students who were not in the education curriculum used to come to my lectures. They liked them. And that's a great encouragement for a lecturer, to think that outsiders want to come and hear you and that something is happening. That was one. Secondly, in my later years there, as I'll explain in a minute, I was travelling a lot abroad and often would have to go to the airport early in the morning. And as much as possible, so as not to interrupt the lectures, I would give the lecture at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 hours. And to my amazement, all the students turned up. I thought that again was a great, very positive thing. You have been a student recently, and you know that maybe to miss a lecture was not so harmful, or you managed it, but they came along in their droves and numbers that way. But during those years when I was lecturing and doing research in education and administration and that, the AIDS epidemic hit the world. I first heard about the AIDS epidemic in 1982. I was actually on an aeroplane travelling to Paris to do something with UNESCO, and there was a copy of Time magazine there, and that's where I read about it first. But when I got back to Zambia, after a year or so, it became obvious that it was strong in Zambia, and we would have to turn our attention to this. And the best attention that we knew about it was the attention of education. Educating people about it, the risks, how to defend themselves and protect themselves, and how to overcome this terrible calamity that had hit the country. And certainly, if I was to outline some of the low points of my life and career, I would say it was those first early years experiencing so many of my friends, young friends, boys, girls, young women, young men, contracting the sickness, dying from it, and no way of helping them. So I got myself involved in this work again, the ignition principle, where there is need, where there is nobody else working at the moment, I got myself involved there. I'm not saying there was nobody else outside the university, but within the university it hadn't yet become a burning issue. And so I got very, very much involved in it. And because I was good at putting things together, at research and administration and these kind of things, I began to get a bit of a name and was called upon to go to many parts of the world to speak, to mobilise, advocate for something to be done in relation to this disease and this epidemic. And so over the years I began to travel more and more and more, and the travelling and the AIDS work became so heavy and so all-embracing that I was no longer being fair to my students at the university by staying there in position. And so early in this century, 2001 I think it was, I retired from the University of Zambia so that I could give myself more fully to the work for AIDS. That time I was travelling maybe about 30 different countries every year. About 250,000, 300,000 miles every year I was travelling. It was pretty heavy on me, but it was really challenging, and it was really fulfilling to see that you could say something to people and they appreciated it, and that they felt, yes, you're speaking to our condition, the way things are. Kazakhstan, Cambodia, Indonesia, Benin, various countries in Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, North America, Cuba even, where I spoke to the ministers of education of all the South American countries. It was a terrible disaster and catastrophe, but at the same time it was enormously fulfilling personally to be able to go and feel I am helping these people in so many different parts of the world, not Catholics of course, there would have been Catholics amongst them, but Hindus and Muslims and Brahmins and all sorts of people, and people of all religions and no religions, but they were hearing what was God's word coming through me, but how to deal with and how to cope with this disease. And there was great joy in my heart when we got the antiretroviral drugs and they became more frequently available, more reasonably available, and I began to see also that there were fewer infections occurring amongst our people. It's still a problem. It's still a major problem. We don't hear about it so much nowadays, but there are still people dying of it because they stopped the drug treatment or because they haven't gone on to the drug treatment. And this is a sadness, and this is something that we should be still addressing very forcibly. But the National AIDS Council and the Ministry of Health are continuing their works in that area. So this was a very big work and a very big demand upon me, and I continued with it. In 2011 I had just come back to Zambia from Hawaii, from speaking there, and one of the wonderful things in Hawaii was that when I was speaking at the university there, I found there was a Zambian there with his wife and children, and not only that, but there were 2 priests in Honolulu, Zambians. Priests, one of them had been at Canisius Secondary School and the other had been at Mukasa. And amazing to find Zambians in such a wonderful part, exotic part of the world. But anyhow, I came back from that and worked on here, but I felt I was getting tired physically inside myself. And I was due to go on leave that year in 2011, and I went. I went on a Sunday, and I arrived in Ireland on a Monday, and by the Tuesday night I was in hospital. And I was diagnosed with serious heart problems, serious heart trouble, and I had to have major surgery on my heart. And I was 7 weeks in hospital, a very dicey recovery. For a long time the doctors thought I wouldn't survive. But looking back, I would say that amongst the accomplishments of my life was staying alive during those 7 weeks, and the transformation from being a globe-trotting professor, I suddenly stopped and became a retired recluse who could do nothing. There was no more work for me. The work finished, as all of a sudden it finished, but it finished when I was a good age already. And so I was able to look back and thank God for a grand life of work and for a life of accomplishment and for a life of fulfillment. And I still look back on that. You ask me, what do I do now? My principal job now is to pray for the Jesuits and to pray for the church. And that is a very important work, most important, and I take it seriously. My ordination as a Jesuit priest in 1961, 55 years ago. That the identification with Jesus Christ at that time, and that from now on I am his priest. That, to me, was the highlight of my whole life, really. And when it came to 50 years later, from 61 to 50 years later, I found I was in hospital. I was recovering from that heart operation I mentioned to you, but I was very conscious of it that day. And on that day, I don't know why, but the medical people brought in a whole lot of cannulas, I think they call them, for inserting in the backs of my hand to let fluids fall into me. I wasn't allowed to eat or swallow anything. And they put these in, and I was thrilled that day. I thought, this is a sign that I'm going to live and I'm going to get better. So my ordination and all the years of priestly ministry that led to, these were the real highlights of my life. And I think the greatest challenge for me is seeing that there are so many poor people amongst us still, and what can we do for them to break this terrible bond of poverty that is entrapping so many of our people. And then within that framework, what more can we do to help the women to advance and to help the children to advance? Well, I want to hark back. I'm an old man, and so I'm privileged to think about the past a little bit. Years ago, the Zambia National Tourist Board had an advertisement. It went out worldwide, and the advertisement was a hippo wallowing in water with the mouth wide open, and the words underneath were, "Come on in, it's great in Zambia." I think it was a marvellous advertisement. I say the same for the Society of Jesus. Come on in, it's great in the Society of Jesus. You will have troubles, you will have difficulties, but you're going to the frontiers. You're going where nobody else is working. You're challenged to do God's work in the way God's want. And as Nicholas said, to find God in all things. Or as Hopkins said, I have this one work to do. Let all God's glory through. That is their challenge. Come on in, join us, and you will be happy and you will be fulfilled.